1874. The family that prayed together every night. Until one day they started eating each other, they were known as the family that prayed together every single night. In the small, wind-beaten town of Hemlock Ridge, 1874, people whispered that no family had ever seemed so pure, so devout, so close to heaven. Every evening the sound of hymns floated from their wooden house on the hill, a fragile melody piercing the silence of the valley below. Yet those who passed by claimed that sometimes, in between the prayers, they heard something else, something that sounded nothing like devotion. They said it began with a smell, not of incense or candle wax, but of something burning, something foul, metallic, and alive. Neighbors tried to ignore it, telling themselves that good families like the Mortons couldn't possibly hide anything wicked. After all, the father, Thomas, was a preacher. His wife, Eleanor, never missed a single service. Their 3 children attended Sunday school dressed in white, heads bowed, eyes pure. To everyone outside, they were a vision of holiness. But holiness, as history reminds us, can rot from within. And sometimes, the more a family hides behind their prayers, the darker their secret becomes. When the first neighbor disappeared, no one connected it to the Mortons. When the second vanished, people whispered about thieves, wild animals, even curses. But on the 7th disappearance, the whispers grew sharper. The town sheriff climbed the hill one night to speak to Thomas. He never came back down. By morning, the hymns continued, louder, more desperate, as if trying to drown out something struggling to escape from beneath the floorboards. What happened inside that house has been buried under a century of fear and silence. Diaries vanished, church records were burned. The last surviving witness never spoke again, except for one trembling line written on a torn piece of Bible paper. They pray before every meal, even now. Tonight, we will open the doors of that forgotten home and uncover the secret that turned faith into something monstrous. We'll trace the prayers, the screams, and the final ritual that left historians speechless. But stay until the end, because the final discovery, hidden beneath the ashes of the Morton home, reveals something no one ever dared to publish. It's a revelation that changes everything we thought we knew about that night in 1874. And it might make you question what your own family prays for when the lights go out. If you think you're ready to see the darkness behind devotion, stay with me. What you're about to hear has never been told in full, until now. The year was 1874, a time when America still trembled from the scars of the Civil War. Small towns like Hemlock Ridge were isolated worlds of their own, surrounded by forests so dense they seemed to breathe. The railroad hadn't reached that far north yet. Messages arrived by horseback, and rumors traveled faster than the wind. People clung to religion like a shield against the wildness that crept at the edges of civilization. Hemlock Ridge was a settlement built by ex-miners and farmers who sought refuge from poverty and shame. Its church was the tallest structure, a crooked white building that leaned slightly to the east as though bowing under the weight of too many confessions. Every night, the bells tolled at 8, calling the faithful to prayer, and at the farthest edge of town stood the Morton home, overlooking the valley like a silent witness. The Mortons were newcomers. Thomas claimed to have come from Ohio, bringing his wife Eleanor and their 3 children after the tragic fire that destroyed their previous home. No one asked too many questions. People in those days believed in starting over, and Thomas's deep voice in Sunday sermons gave him a strange authority. He spoke of purification, of sin devoured by faith, of the body being offered as bread before the Lord. Many didn't understand his words, but his passion made them nod anyway. The family's house was built of blackened oak, its windows always closed, its curtains never drawn. Neighbors swore that even on bright mornings, the Mortons' home remained cloaked in shadow, as though the sun itself refused to enter. They lived simply, but no one ever saw them buy meat or bread at the market. Eleanor, pale and silent, often carried buckets of something dark from the back garden and poured it into the earth. When asked what it was, she would only smile faintly and say, "It feeds the ground, as the ground feeds us." At first, the town pitied them. They had lost everything in the fire, they said, but pity turned to unease when children playing near the hill reported seeing faces at the windows. Pale, hollow-eyed faces that didn't belong to anyone in the family. The local pastor dismissed it as imagination, but when his dog vanished the next morning and a crimson stain appeared on the snow near the Mortons' fence, even he began to wonder. Hemlock Ridge had no police, only a sheriff who preferred whiskey to trouble. So when the first disappearance occurred, a drifter named Samuel, who had come begging for food, no one investigated. The Mortons offered prayers for his soul, and the town moved on. But soon, more travelers vanished. A salesman, a widow, a young boy collecting firewood, always near the Morton property. The people whispered of spirits, of old curses carried from the war, of hunger that wasn't human. Some said the family prayed not to God, but to something older, something that demanded sacrifice. By winter, the once bustling town had grown silent. Doors were bolted at dusk, lanterns burned through the night. And still, from the hill above, the Mortons' hymns echoed, soft at first, then rising in strange harmonies that no one recognized. It was in that atmosphere of fear and faith that the legend of the praying family began. A story passed down in fragments scribbled in forgotten diaries and whispered by those who claimed to have heard the chanting themselves. And though the official records of Hemlock Ridge ended abruptly in 1875, the house remains standing to this day. Locals avoid it. Birds never land on its roof, and those who dare to enter say the air inside tastes like iron and ashes. This is where our story unfolds, in the intersection between faith and madness, devotion and hunger. Because beneath that roof, prayers were not meant for salvation, but for something far more ancient and far more hungry. Thomas Morton was a man of deep eyes and deeper silence. To the people of Hemlock Ridge, he appeared as a preacher without a pulpit, a father whose devotion bordered on sainthood. He spoke little, worked hard, and prayed often. But those who stood close enough to hear his voice during evening hymns said it trembled, not with humility but with something else, something that sounded like fear. His wife, Eleanor, was the picture of quiet obedience. Her beauty had faded early, the fire that took their first home leaving scars not only on her body, but in her mind. She moved through life as if her soul had been half buried in the ashes they fled from. She smiled when spoken to, but never laughed. At night, she was seen kneeling by the window, whispering prayers too low for anyone to hear, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Then there were the children. Mary, the eldest, at 13, who kept a small wooden cross tied around her neck with a fraying red string. Jacob, 10, curious and restless, often caught staring at things that weren't there. And little Ruth, only 6, who never spoke a word after the journey from Ohio. Some said she had seen something during that fire, something that followed them even here. The Mortons were bound by grief, faith, and something darker. An invisible thread that pulled them toward their nightly ritual. Every evening, as the clock struck 8, Thomas would gather his family in the candlelit parlor. The windows were sealed shut, the curtains drawn, the room filled with the scent of burning oil and something metallic beneath it. They would hold hands, bow their heads, and begin to pray in perfect unison, their voices rising and falling like a single heartbeat. To outsiders, it might have looked holy, but anyone who heard it up close said it didn't sound like prayer. It was rhythmic, repetitive, almost chant-like, as if each word was being offered to something waiting in the shadows. Mary, the eldest, was the first to sense the wrongness. She started having dreams, flames in the walls, faces in the smoke, whispers calling her name. One night she told her mother, "They're not gone, Mama. They're waiting for us." Eleanor shushed her, pressing a finger to her lips, tears glistening in her eyes. "Don't speak of them," she whispered, "not when the Lord can hear." But who was the Lord they prayed to? That question would haunt Mary for the rest of her short life. Despite the unease that surrounded them, there were moments of tenderness too, small, fleeting glimpses of humanity. Thomas teaching Jacob how to carve wood by lamplight, Eleanor humming lullabies from her childhood while brushing Ruth's tangled hair. Yet even these moments seemed strained, as though every gesture of love was weighed down by guilt. The family rarely left the house. When they did, they moved together, always together, as if separation itself was forbidden. On Sundays, they would walk to church hand in hand, heads bowed. They never spoke to others, not even after the sermons ended. When townsfolk greeted them, the Mortons smiled politely, but their eyes seemed empty, lost in some distant terror. And yet, despite their silence, people pitied them. The tragedy they'd endured had softened hearts, until small, unsettling details began to surface. The butcher noticed that Thomas never bought meat. The tailor said Eleanor once paid for fabric, with coins sticky and dark. And one winter night, a farm. Boy swore he saw Thomas in the woods, kneeling before something buried under the snow, his breath rising like smoke as he whispered words the boy couldn't understand. Still, no one confronted them. They were, after all, the praying family. And in Hemlock Ridge, prayer meant protection, but soon the town would learn that not all prayers reach heaven. Some echo back from somewhere else, from a place that listens too closely, waiting for someone desperate enough to feed it. It began, as most horrors do, with something small, something so ordinary that no one noticed at first. One morning, as the mist hung low over Hemlock Ridge, a farmer named Elias Turner found a bundle near the creek. Wrapped in a torn piece of linen, it looked like discarded meat from a butcher's cart. But when he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. Inside were small bones, too delicate to be animal, too human to be ignored. The sheriff was called, though he came reluctantly, smelling of liquor and disbelief. He examined the bones, turned the cloth over, and found a single embroidered letter on the fabric's corner, E. The same cursive initial stitched into the hems of Eleanor Morton's dresses. When asked about it, she only smiled and said softly, "Children's toys. We bury what's broken." Her calmness chilled everyone present. That night, the hymns from the Morton house began earlier than usual, and they were louder. Not joyous, not mournful, but urgent, frantic, as if every word was meant to hold something back. Those who lived nearest swore they heard other voices joining in, not belonging to the family, deeper, raspier, rising from the ground itself. A few days later, strange markings appeared along the trees bordering the Morton property, symbols carved crudely into the bark, spirals, eyes, and what looked like open mouths. Jacob, the middle child, was seen tracing them with his fingers when he thought no one was watching. When the blacksmith's wife asked what they meant, he whispered, "They keep us safe." But safe from what? Then came the smell, thick and sweet, drifting down the hill like rot soaked in sugar. The townspeople tried to ignore it, tried to believe it was just spoiled meat or the carcass of an animal left too long in the cold. But the odor never faded, it only grew stronger. When a storm struck a week later, lightning lit the Morton house like a lantern. For the briefest second, a figure was seen standing in the attic window, too tall to be Thomas, too thin to be Eleanor. And in its hand, witnesses swore they saw something glistening, like a jawbone. Mary, the eldest daughter, began wandering into town after dark, her eyes glassy, her voice low and distant. She spoke to no one except the church's old caretaker, Mr. Gibbons, who claimed she once whispered to him, "They're hungry again." When he asked who she meant, she only smiled and said, "The ones who pray after we sleep." By now, Even the pastor avoided mentioning the Mortons by name during sermons. It was said that speaking of them drew their attention. Children crossed themselves when passing the hill. Dogs howled toward their home but refused to climb the slope. And still, every night at 8, the family gathered to pray. No matter the rain, no matter the thunder, their candles burned, a flickering glow behind shuttered windows. Elias Turner, haunted by what he'd found by the creek, returned one night with a lantern and courage soaked in whiskey. He crept up the hill, hiding behind the withered trees, and peered through the cracks of the Morton barn. What he saw made him drop the lantern and run until his lungs tore. Inside, he said, were altars, not made of stone, but of wood and bone, and on each, the initials of the townspeople carved carefully into the flesh. By morning, Elias was gone. His house stood empty, his horse still tied to the fence. The only thing left behind was his lantern, sitting at the foot of the Morton Hill, still burning. As fear began to seep through Hemlock Ridge like fog, the town's fragile sense of faith cracked. The Mortons, once seen as holy survivors of tragedy, had become the center of every whispered prayer for deliverance. The townspeople wanted to believe it was superstition, that Elias Turner had simply fled, drunk and haunted by his imagination. But deep down, they knew something was terribly wrong. Thomas Morton continued to hold his nightly gatherings, but now the windows of his house pulsed with red light. The singing that once sounded like hymns had shifted, slower, heavier, with guttural murmurs between each verse. The pastor, Reverend Clark, finally decided to act. He gathered a few men, Bible in one hand and rifle in the other, and climbed the hill one freezing night. They knocked. No one answered. But from inside they heard movement, not footsteps but dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. When Thomas finally opened the door, the men froze. His eyes were sunken, his skin greyish, his lips cracked and trembling as though every word he spoke hurt to form. "We're cleansing the flesh," he whispered. "The Lord demanded a purer meal." The pastor's voice broke. "Thomas, this is madness. God doesn't ask for blood." Thomas smiled, a thin, unnatural curve that didn't reach his eyes. "Then tell me, Reverend, whose God do you serve?" The door slammed shut before anyone could move. Moments later, the chanting began again, louder this time, fierce and rhythmic, shaking the glass in the window panes. One of the men swore he saw shadows writhing on the walls, twisting like smoke. They fled before the prayer ended. In the days that followed, the injustices grew harder to ignore. Livestock were found mutilated, their carcasses arranged in circles. A widow's baby disappeared from its crib. When Eleanor Morton was seen at dawn walking barefoot through the cemetery, her dress soaked with something dark, the town demanded justice. But justice in Hemlock Ridge had no law, only fear. The sheriff, shamed into action, declared he would confront the Mortons once and for all. He never made it to the hill. His horse was found wandering aimlessly by the creek, its saddle torn and dripping red. Eleanor appeared in town 2 nights later, carrying a wicker basket covered with cloth. She walked straight to the church, placed it on the altar, and said, "They wanted to give thanks." Then she left without another word. When Reverend Clark lifted the cloth, he found inside a loaf of bread, warm, steaming, but the smell was unbearable. And in the crust, something gleamed white, a human tooth. That was the night the pastor wrote in his journal, "The Mortons have turned their prayers into hunger. What they consume is not flesh alone, it's faith itself." The injustice was no longer spiritual, it was human, rooted in suffering that no one dared to face. The town had abandoned the Mortons when the fire took everything from them. No one offered help, no one opened their doors. Perhaps, in their isolation, something else had found them, something that promised comfort in exchange for devotion. But devotion twisted by despair becomes something else entirely. By spring, the Mortons stopped attending church. No one saw them during the day. Smoke rose from their chimney every night, carrying that same metallic scent that clung to the air long after dawn. The townspeople began to lock their doors and bury their fears. Yet every evening, when the church bell tolled at 8, they heard the faint echo of voices praying in unison from the hill. Voices that no longer sounded entirely human. The storm that broke over Hemlock Ridge that spring was unlike anything the town had seen in years. The rain came down in sheets, drenching the earth until the roads turned to rivers of mud. Lightning split the sky again and again, illuminating the Morton house on the hill like a spectre. Each flash revealed a different shape in the windows, sometimes a shadow, sometimes a face, and once, unmistakably, a hand pressed against the glass, clawing from the inside. The townspeople huddled in their homes, praying for the storm to pass. But the Reverend could no longer sit still, driven by guilt and by something darker, the feeling that God himself had turned his gaze away. He took a lantern and climbed the hill alone. The wind screamed through the trees as he neared the house. The front door stood half open, swaying with the wind. Inside, the air was thick with decay. Candles burned low, dripping wax onto a table covered in open Bibles, every page torn, every verse crossed out except one. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. The Reverend's hands trembled as he stepped forward. The smell of copper filled his lungs. He heard movement in the next room, soft footsteps, like a child's. "Hello?" he whispered. A voice answered, faint, melodic. "They're almost ready." He turned. At the end of the hallway stood Mary Morton, her nightdress soaked, her eyes wide and unblinking. In her small hands she held a bowl. The contents glistened under the lantern light, red, thick, still steaming. "What are you doing, child?" the Reverend asked, his voice barely a breath. Mary smiled, not cruelly but with a kind of peace that chilled him to the bone. "Father says this is the only way to keep them close. If we eat together, they never leave." Behind her, something moved. The Reverend took a step forward, and the floor groaned. He looked down. The wooden boards were soft, warped. With one more step they gave way. He fell into darkness. When he landed, the lantern shattered beside him, the flame flickering weakly. The stench was unbearable, rot, sweat, and something sweeter, like decayed fruit. As his eyes adjusted, he realized where he was, a basement, or rather a pit. The walls were lined with crosses carved into the dirt, each one marked with initials, and in the center of the room sat a long table made of rough planks, and bones. Around it, figures knelt in prayer. They were barely recognizable as human, skin stretched, hair matted, lips torn from constant murmuring. Among them, he saw Thomas and Eleanor, their faces serene, their eyes closed as they swayed to the rhythm of their chant. Between them lay the remnants of something, a body half consumed. The Reverend screamed and scrambled backward. The figures turned slowly, their eyes reflecting the lantern's dying light. Thomas spoke first. "You shouldn't have come, Reverend. You weren't invited to supper." The Reverend stumbled up the broken stairs, his hands slick with blood. He ran into the storm, never stopping until he reached the church. By morning, his hair had turned white. He refused to speak for days, only rocking in silence, clutching his Bible against his chest. When he finally did speak, his words were a whisper no one forgot. They were praying over what they'd already eaten. After that night, no one dared to go near the Morton house again. The storm had washed half the hill into the valley, leaving the home leaning at an impossible angle. Yet even from a distance, the townspeople swore they could still hear the faint hum of voices carried on the wind, praying, eating, and praying again, as if the ritual would never end. And in the hollow that once served as their cellar, A single candle continued to burn, though no one was left alive to light it. Ilya barely slept that night. Every shadow in the cottage seemed to twitch with life, every creak of the floorboards echoing the whispers from the tunnels below. His mind raced with images of his family, half buried, their eyes sealed shut, yet somehow still pleading for him. The rain had stopped, but the valley remained cloaked in an unnatural fog, and he felt the land itself holding its breath. By dawn, he resolved to return, though a gnawing fear clutched at his chest. He fetched a lantern, a rope, and a small iron pick, determined to explore further. He needed answers, not for himself alone, but for Marek, Daria, and Annika. If he could find even a trace of them, perhaps there was a way to undo what had been done. At the edge of the field, he noticed something new. Footprints, small and narrow, pressed into the softened mud. They did not belong to him, nor any peasant he knew. They led away from the well toward the dense forest behind the manor ruins. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and in their shadows, the fog seemed to thicken. Following the trail, Ilya's heart pounded with both hope and dread. The footprints ended at a hollow in the forest floor, where the roots of an enormous oak had been twisted to form a natural arch. Beneath it lay a small wooden chest, blackened with age. The lid was cracked as if someone or something had forced it open before. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of strange objects, fragments of bone, rusted iron tools, and a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon identical to Daria's. He pulled the letters free and unfolded the topmost one. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike, and yet unmistakable. It was Daria's. "Father, I cannot explain. We are not as we were. Something watches from beneath. It is not the Baron, not entirely. The earth itself moves, listens, remembers. We are trapped. But there is a way. You must follow the marks and the ground will show you." Ilya dropped the letter, heart racing. What could this mean? His children were alive but changed, and who or what had guided the chest here? He felt a surge of anger and confusion. The Baron was dead, burned by the flames that had consumed his manor, yet the evil lingered, hidden, patient, and far older than any man. He noticed the symbols etched into the inside of the chest, circles, spirals, and jagged lines identical to those in the tunnels. They glowed faintly when he touched them. The letters had mentioned following the marks, but where? He looked around the hollow and saw them, faint scratches on the roots of the oak, forming a narrow path deeper into the forest. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. The valley, the manor, the tunnels, they had already taken so much. But another voice, quiet and insistent, pushed him forward. He thought of Annika, Marek, Daria. They were alive somewhere, and the chest had been left as a guide. Whoever, or whatever, left it wanted him to follow. He took a deep breath, grabbed the lantern, and stepped onto the path. The fog twisted around him, thickening with every step. Strange shapes moved at the edges of his vision, branches that bent like arms, shadows that lingered too long. He felt eyes on him, not human, watching from the darkness. At the end of the path, he found another entrance, partially hidden by vines and moss. Unlike the well, this opening descended not into stone, but into soil that was soft and strangely warm. The air rising from below smelled of iron and wet earth. A low hum vibrated through the ground beneath his feet, rhythmic and deliberate, as if the earth itself were alive and aware of his presence. Ilya hesitated, hand on the rope ladder. The letters had promised guidance, yet he could not shake the feeling that what waited below was both a revelation and a trap. He felt a mixture of dread and determination. The partial twist of fate had given him a clue, but it had also opened a new, far darker enigma. With one final glance at the surface, he descended. The forest above vanished behind him, replaced by the suffocating closeness of the earth. And somewhere beneath, whispers rose again, an unbroken chorus of voices both familiar and alien calling his name. The path had begun, but the destination remained uncertain. And Ilya knew with chilling certainty that once he stepped fully into the darkness, there would be no turning back. When the floodwaters finally receded, what remained of Hemlock Ridge was little more than silence and mud. The Mortons' home leaned crookedly, half sunken into the earth, its windows shattered, its door hanging open like a broken mouth. No one dared to step inside. But one day, in midsummer, strangers arrived, 4 men in dark coats, claiming to be from the state. They said they were investigating the religious disturbance that had destroyed the town's peace. They carried notebooks, crosses, and shovels. They called themselves truth seekers, but they behaved more like men chasing ghosts. They interviewed what few survivors remained. Each told a different story, yet every version ended the same way, with prayers, screams, and the taste of blood in the air. When the investigators reached the hill, the smell hit them before the sight did. Something was rotting beneath the soil. They dug near the foundation and uncovered dozens of small wooden boxes, sealed with wax and marked with symbols, spirals, eyes, and open mouths, the same carvings found on the trees months before. Inside each box were human teeth, hundreds of them, arranged neatly as though part of some sacred collection. That night, they stayed in town, and none could sleep. The next morning, one of the men, the youngest, named Carter, was gone. His bed was soaked through with water, though no rain had fallen. Only his journal remained. The last line he'd written read, "They were never praying to God." The following evening, the others returned to the Morton house, determined to end what had begun there. As they descended into the ruins, they found the basement collapsed, but a tunnel gaped open beneath it, carved deep into the rock. Lanterns flickered as they entered. The air was heavy with heat, as if the earth itself was breathing. The passage led them to a chamber lined with bones arranged in careful spirals. In the center stood an altar, the same one the Reverend had described before he went mad. Upon it rested an open Bible, its pages soaked and stuck together with something red. But there was writing underneath, faint, etched directly into the wood. Words not found in any scripture. They read, "The flesh remembers, the faithful shall consume and be one." The men fled, but only 2 reached the surface. The third, Father Bellamy, lingered behind, drawn to a faint sound echoing from the depths. He later told the others what he saw before the tunnel collapsed, a small child kneeling in the dark, her hands folded in prayer. When he shone his lantern on her face, he realized it was Ruth Morton. But she had not aged. Her eyes gleamed gold, and her mouth twisted into a smile. "They're still praying," she said, "and now you are one of us." The survivors left Hemlock Ridge before dawn. They sealed the records, swore oaths of silence, and vanished into anonymity. The government labeled the case an act of hysteria caused by famine and isolation, but in a hidden report, later uncovered by a historian nearly a century later, one chilling detail stood out. The dental analysis of the boxes found near the Morton house revealed that several teeth belonged to the same individuals, repeated, replicated, as if they had grown again. The culmination of the Mortons' dark legacy arrived not with fanfare, but with the slow, suffocating realization of the true horror that had unfolded over the years. By the summer of 1875, Hemlock Ridge had become a ghost town, abandoned by nearly all who once called it home. Those few who remained were haunted, not just by memories, but by the pervasive knowledge that the Mortons' prayers had never truly ended. Something ancient, something unnatural lingered in that house on the hill, feeding on devotion, fear, and flesh. The Reverend Clark, now a frail and trembling man, had been driven nearly insane by what he had witnessed. Night after night, he heard the faint echo of the family's hymns carried on the wind. their rhythm meticulous, unbroken. He had tried to tell the townsfolk, to warn them, but no one could comprehend the gravity of what had occurred. "They pray together," he whispered endlessly, "and they consume together. The two cannot be separated." Then came Father Bellamy and his two companions, the so-called investigators who had dared to enter the Morton ruins months before. They were determined to document the truth, armed with lanterns, journals, and an unwavering belief that reason could conquer even the darkest superstition. They descended into the collapsed cellar once more, the air heavy with rot and the faint metallic tang of iron. Their footsteps echoed in the hollow tunnels, each one a drumbeat of impending revelation. The chamber they found was beyond description. Bones formed patterns across the floor, spirals and circles that seemed ritualistic, almost ceremonial. Against the far wall stood an altar of splintered wood, atop which rested a Bible soaked in blood and smeared with strange symbols. The investigators could make out faint etchings beneath the ink, messages carved into the wood itself, words that whispered in the flickering lamplight. "They are one with the sacrifice," Bellamy murmured, his voice quivering. "They do not merely pray, they partake, they become the offering." It was then that they saw her, Ruth Morton, no older than the day she vanished, kneeling with perfect composure. Her eyes glowed unnaturally gold, reflecting the lantern light like twin flames. The room seemed to pulse around her, the air vibrating with the low, rhythmic chant of the Mortons' voices. Though long dead by all accounts, the family's presence lingered, not as ghosts, but as something else entirely, a living ritual, endless and consuming. Mary and Jacob appeared beside her, unchanged by time, their features serene, their mouths moving in silent prayer. Thomas and Eleanor stood behind the children, their hands folded, eyes closed, as if in meditation. Yet every movement seemed purposeful, deliberate, a choreography dictated by some unseen force. And beneath them, the remnants of their victims lay carefully arranged, forming intricate designs that made the investigators' stomachs churn. Bellamy tried to speak, to demand that this madness cease, but no words could penetrate the unnatural calm. Then, as if sensing their intrusion, Ruth lifted her gaze and whispered softly, yet every word reverberated through the chamber. "You cannot leave unchanged. Faith is the body, devotion the blood. To witness is to partake." At that moment, the investigators understood the horrifying truth. The Mortons had not simply turned to cannibalism out of desperation or madness. Their devotion had been transformed, twisted by isolation and tragedy into a covenant older than the town itself. They had discovered a secret, that faith, when consumed with flesh and blood, becomes eternal. The family had not died. They had become perpetual, sustained by the prayers and fear of anyone who knew their story. The walls seemed to close in as the air thickened with the scent of iron and smoke. Bellamy's companion collapsed, gagging, while the Reverend's trembling hands clutched the edge of the altar. Outside, the storm returned, though no cloud had formed. Lightning splitting the sky above the house as if heaven itself recoiled. And then, the final revelation came. Hidden in a corner of the chamber, beneath a loose stone, Bellamy found a collection of journals, meticulously kept, each page detailing names, dates, and acts of devotion and consumption. Some entries described strangers who had wandered too close to the Morton home. Others chronicled family members who had been incorporated into the ritual. The handwriting was precise, almost reverent. Every act, every meal, every prayer was recorded as though it were scripture. Bellamy realized, with a shiver that froze his blood, that the Mortons' legacy could not be erased. Their faith had transcended mortality. Any who uncovered the truth risked being drawn into it, becoming part of the ritual whether they wished to or not. They were eternal, feeding on devotion and fear, hidden in plain sight behind the veil of a simple family who prayed together every night. The chamber seemed to breathe, alive with whispers and echoes. The investigators fled, leaving behind their lanterns, their notes, and their sanity. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of the Mortons' hymns, slow, deliberate, and infinitely patient. And somewhere within the house on the hill, Ruth's voice rose above the others, clear and commanding. "Faith sustains, flesh obeys, and now you have witnessed what cannot be undone." The story of Hemlock Ridge and the Mortons would never reach the broader world. Records were lost, townsfolk scattered, and anyone who came too close vanished without trace. But for those who dared to remember, the truth was terrifying and unyielding. Devotion, when twisted by darkness and consumed literally, becomes immortal. A covenant written in blood, never to be broken and eternally hungry. The story of the Mortons does not end with their disappearance or the ruin of Hemlock Ridge. It lingers in the mind like a shadow that refuses to fade. For decades, historians dismissed the accounts as folklore, a cautionary tale of isolation and madness. Yet the fragments of evidence, journals, witness testimonies, and the occasional unexplainable artifact suggest that something far more sinister occurred. The Mortons' devotion had become a force, one that blurred the line between faith and horror, piety and predation. To consider their actions solely as cannibalism or insanity is to miss the larger, chilling truth. They manipulated belief itself. They exploited the town's trust in religious ritual, cloaking their atrocities beneath the guise of prayer and morality. In doing so, they created a cycle where fear and reverence fed the unthinkable, turning everyday devotion into a tool for control. This was injustice at its most insidious, hidden behind the very practices meant to protect souls. Emotionally, the story strikes at the heart. It forces us to confront how desperation, isolation, and grief can warp even the most sacred bonds. A family that once symbolized unity and faith became an instrument of terror, a reminder that evil can arise quietly, nurtured in plain sight. The pain inflicted upon victims, both known and lost to history, lingers, their suffering woven into the fabric of the hill where the Mortons once lived. The psychological impact on Hemlock Ridge was profound. Survivors were left hollow, plagued by the knowledge that evil had not only existed, but had been methodical, almost ritualistic. The reverberations of that horror shaped generations, embedding cautionary tales into the town's culture, warning children to fear what lurks behind closed doors and what may hide behind the familiar faces of neighbors. Historically, the Mortons' story forces reflection on the fragility of communities and the power of belief. In a society recovering from war, poverty, and disease, faith was both sanctuary and weapon. The Mortons exploited this duality, showing how devotion could be twisted into a mechanism of survival, one that demanded the unthinkable. It is a stark reminder that history is not always heroic or moral. It is often messy, terrifying, and shaped by the darkest impulses of humanity. And yet, there is a lesson in the terror. The Mortons' tale underscores the need for vigilance, empathy, and critical thought. Blind faith, unexamined tradition, or unquestioned authority can become the very chains that allow injustice to thrive. Their story invites us to question, to observe, and to honor the victims whose voices were silenced, ensuring that history remembers not just the horrors, but the humanity lost within them. Ultimately, the legacy of the Mortons is a mirror. It reflects both the capacity for devotion and the capacity for destruction, showing how closely love and horror can intertwine. Hemlock Ridge may have faded from maps, but the echoes of that family's prayers and the darkness they concealed remain a haunting testament to the thin line between faith and fanaticism, between reverence and atrocity. If the story of the Mortons has left you unsettled, you're not alone. Hemlock Ridge may be gone from maps, but the echoes of that family's prayers linger. A chilling reminder of how devotion can be twisted into something unthinkable. Imagine living in a world where the people you trust most are capable of unspeakable acts, hidden behind the veil of faith and tradition. What would you do if you discovered the truth? I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the Morton's story is purely legend, or could there be fragments of truth still buried in the ruins of that hill? Could such darkness exist behind closed doors even today, in places we think are safe? Share your theories and reactions in the comments below. The discussion you start might uncover perspectives that no one has considered before. And if you found yourself captivated or even horrified by this journey into one of history's darkest mysteries, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Each week we dive into stories that blur the line between history and horror, revealing secrets that have been buried for decades, sometimes centuries. By subscribing, you ensure that you will never miss a story that challenges your understanding of the past and makes you question the world around you. Finally, consider this. The Morton's story is not just about fear. It's about vigilance, about seeing what others overlook, and about remembering that even the smallest details can hold the key to understanding unimaginable truths. If you want to continue uncovering dark histories, leave a comment, subscribe, and join a community dedicated to exploring the secrets that history tried to bury. Your voice could be part of uncovering the next revelation. As we step back from the shadow of Hemlock Ridge, the story of the Mortons lingers, refusing to fade. Their prayers, once a symbol of unity and faith, became a vessel